Currently, on July 22nd in 1862, our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, informs his chief advisors and cabinet that he will issue a proclamation to free enslaved people. The president also adds that he will wait until the Union Army achieves substantial victory to make the announcement. Attempting to stitch together a nation mired in a bloody civil war, Abraham Lincoln made a last-ditch but carefully calculated executive decision regarding the institution of slavery in America. At the time of the meeting with his cabinet, things were not looking good for the Union. The Confederate Army had overcome Union troops in significant battles, and Britain and France were set to officially recognize the Confederacy as a separate nation. The issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation had less to do with ending slavery than saving the crumbling nation. In an August 1862 letter to New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley, Lincoln confessed, quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery," unquote. He hoped a strong statement declaring a national policy of emancipation would stimulate a rush of the South's enslaved people into the ranks of the Union Army, thus depleting the Confederacy labor force, on which it depended to wage war against the North. As promised, Lincoln waited to unveil the proclamation until he could do so on the heels of a successful Union military advance. On September 22nd in 1862, after a victory at Antietam, he publicly announced a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring all enslaved people free in the rebellious states as of January 1st, 1863. Lincoln and his advisors limited the proclamation's language to slavery in states outside of federal control as of 1862. The proclamation did not, however, address the contentious issue of slavery within the nation's border states. In his attempt to appease all parties, Lincoln left many loopholes open that civil rights advocates would be forced to tackle in the future. On July 22nd in 1916, a massive parade held in San Francisco, California, to celebrate Preparedness Day in anticipation of our country's entrance into World War I is disrupted by the explosion of a suitcase bomb, which sends 10 bystanders into the eternity and wounds 40 more. By the summer of 1916, with the Great War raging in Europe, and with our country and other neutral ships threatened by German submarine aggression, it had become clear to our nation's government that we could not stand on the sideline much longer. With this in mind, leading business figures in the city of San Francisco planned a parade in honor of American military preparedness. As the event neared, it was clear that anti-war and isolationist sentiments ran high among a significant population of the city and the country, not only among such radical organizations as International Workers of the World, the so-called, quote, wobblies, unquote, but among mainstream labor leaders. These opponents of the Preparedness Day event undoubtedly shared the view voiced publicly by one critic, former U.S. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who claimed that the organizers of San Francisco's financiers and factory owners were acting in pure self-interest, as they clearly stood to benefit from an increased production of munitions. The Preparedness Day parade went ahead on Saturday, July 22nd, with a 3.5-hour-long procession of some 51,300 329 marchers, including 52 bands and 2,134 organizations comprising military, civic, judicial, state, and municipal divisions, as well as newspaper, telephone, telegraph, and streetcar unions. At 2:06 p.m., about half hour after the parade began, a bomb concealed in a suitcase exploded on the west side of Stewart Street, just south of Market Street near the Ferry Building. Two radical labor leaders, Thomas Mooney and Warren K. Billings, were subsequently arrested and tried for the attack. In the trial that followed, complete with false witnesses and biased jury foremen, the two men were convicted despite widespread belief that they had been framed by the prosecution. Mooney was sentenced to death, and evidence surfaced as to the corrupt nature of the prosecution. Our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, called on the California governor, William Stevens, to look further into the case. 2 weeks before Mooney's scheduled execution, Stevens, the governor, commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, the same punishment Billings had received. Investigation into the case continued over the next 2 decades, and by 1939, evidence of perjury and false testimony at the trial had so mounted that Governor Colbert Olson pardoned both men. The true identity of the Preparedness Day bomber or bombers remains unknown. On July 22nd in 1987, in a dramatic turnaround, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev indicates that he is willing to negotiate a ban on intermediate-range nuclear missiles without conditions. Gorbachev's decision paved the way for the groundbreaking Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty with our country. Since coming to power in 1985, Gorbachev had made it clear that he sought a less contentious relationship with the U.S. His American counterpart, Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, was a staunch anti-communist and initially harbored deep suspicions about Gorbachev's sincerity. After meeting with Gorbachev in November 1985, however, Reagan came to believe that progress might be made on a number of issues, including arms control. In subsequent summit meetings, the two leaders focused on the so-called intermediate-range nuclear missiles that both nations had massed in Europe and around the world. In late 1986, it appeared that the two nations were close to an agreement that would eliminate the weapons from Europe. Negotiations stumbled, however, when Gorbachev demanded that the elimination of the missiles be accompanied by our country's abandonment of our development of the strategic initiative Star Wars plan. The talks broke down while Reagan and Gorbachev traded accusations of bad faith. On July 22, 1987, Gorbachev dramatically announced that he was ready to discuss the elimination of intermediate-range missiles on a worldwide basis with no conditions. By dropping his objection to the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was one of Reagan's pet projects, Gorbachev cleared the way for negotiations, and he and Reagan agreed to meet again. Mikhail Gorbachev's change of mind was a result of a number of factors. His own nation was suffering from serious economic problems, and Gorbachev desperately wanted to cut Russia's military spending. In addition, the growing no nukes movement in Europe was interfering with his ability to conduct diplomatic relations with France, Great Britain, and other Western European nations. Finally, Gorbachev seemed to have a sincere personal trust in and friendship with Ronald Reagan, and this feeling was apparently reciprocal. In December 1987, during a summit in Washington, the two men signed off on the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. On July 22nd in 2003, U.S. Army Private Jessica Lynch, a prisoner of war who was rescued from an Iraqi hospital, receives a hero's welcome when she returns to her hometown of Palestine, West Virginia. The story of the 19-year-old supply clerk who was captured by Iraqi forces in March 2003 gripped our country. However, it was later revealed that some details of Lynch's dramatic capture and rescue might have been exaggerated. Lynch, who was born April 26 in 1983, was part of the 507th Ordnance Maintenance Company from Fort Bliss, Texas. On March 23, 2003, just days after the U.S. invaded Iraq, Lynch was riding in a supply convoy when her unit took a wrong turn and was ambushed by Iraqi forces near Nasiriyah. 11 American soldiers continued their eternity, and 4 others besides Lynch were captured during this event. Lynch, who sustained multiple broken bones and other injuries when her vehicle crashed during the ambush, was taken to an Iraqi hospital. On April 1st, she was rescued by U.S. Special Forces who raided the hospital where she was being held. They also recovered the bodies of 8 of Lynch's fellow soldiers. Lynch was taken to a military hospital in Germany for treatment and then returned to the U.S. Lynch's story garnered mass media attention and she became an overnight celebrity. Various reports emerged about Lynch's experience, with some news accounts indicating that even after Lynch was wounded during the ambush, she fought back against her captors. However, Lynch later stated that she had been knocked unconscious after her vehicle crashed and couldn't remember the details of what had happened to her. She also said she had not been mistreated by the staff at the Iraqi hospital and they put up no resistance to her rescue. Critics and Lynch herself charged our government with embellishing her story to boost patriotism and to help promote the controversial Iraq War. In August of 2003, Lynch received a medical honorable discharge. She collaborated on a book about her experience, I Am a Soldier, too. The Jessica Lynch story, which was released later that year. In April of 2007, Lynch testified before Congress that she had falsely been portrayed as a, quote, little girl Rambo, unquote, and the U.S. military had hyped her story for propaganda reasons. According to Lynch, quote, I am still confused as to why they chose to lie and tried to make me a legend when the real heroics of my fellow soldiers that day were in fact legendary. She also added, quote, the truth of war is not always easy to hear, but is always more heroic than the hype, unquote. All historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on History.com.